Well, good afternoon, everybody. So, from the fire and emergency medical services perspective, just say these last few months has been interesting, and it continues to evolve even as we speak today. And I'm sure from the law enforcement perspective that, we'll hear from Rick's experiences, his people's experiences, that is also the case in this environment. Probably not going to have, like, we'll call it a hard stop when this happens and this stops, because this is not necessarily like the traditional emergency that we often think of. This continues to evolve, and we get new information all the time. I'm sure from Mike, from your perspective, from the hospitals, and what some of the other healthcare facilities are saying, this will continue to shift and reshape things into the future. So a couple of, just to hit on a couple of points on the timeline, if you will. We know that right around the first of the year, January 1st, January 2nd, we started to, the Centers for Disease Control started to identify that there was some people coming into the country that were sick and they weren't sure what the problem was. So, and then if we flash forward to January 26th, there was the first confirmed case in California. And that continued to expand beyond that then to, on March 4th, the state of California declared an emergency. On March 17th, the city declared a state of emergency. And these things are done so that, one, you have a better level of control and being able to coordinate and access resources. So that's also one of the things that, if we look from a nationwide perspective, there are a lot of states that they never really took this very seriously, I'll say, and the response may be a little bit different, we'll see. So even as we speak today, I think it's Thursday, right? Thursdays we continue to have our Emergency Operations Center briefing on a weekly basis at this point. So the city continues to work on this. I'd like to share a few of the priorities that were set forth from the city. So I think these are important things. One is the ability to maintain continuity of government. If you're familiar, there were some cities where the city leadership was infected and taken out, and so what does that do to your local government? Can have a big impact. Being able to continue to maintain your emergency service capability. There were some fire departments, I know, I'm not sure about police departments, but some fire departments that had to shut down stations because they simply did not have enough people to staff like they normally did, because people got infected, they got sick, and they had to shut them down. We had to focus on public hygiene for the homeless population, because one of the things that came out very early is that not being hygienic would increase the likelihood of you contracting this. So, coordinating disaster response, very important stuff. Also, so did anybody have a business here that had to shut down? Because a lot of businesses had to shut down, things like that, and so how does the city help provide support to those businesses now at this point? And then continuing to conduct community outreach and education, because you might find this hard to believe, but everything you read on the internet is not necessarily true. So Rick's pointed that out to me a few times. So there's a lot of information out there, and people get this wrong information, and then they make a decision based on that. So from the fire and EMS standpoint, one of the things that was done very early on was we looked at it from the entire county perspective. So all of the county fire departments put together and operated under what we called an incident management team, or refer to it as an IMT, and that involved all the fire agencies and the ambulance agencies in the county, so that we could better coordinate response, and also looked at modifying some of the response protocols because of what was going on. So that was actually a very good thing, and that partnership that was established, that was in late February, early March, that continues today, and that's one of those things that from these types of events, you end up with these relationships and you'll continue to move forward. So it's a very positive thing as far as that goes. We also looked at modifying our response plans, and I'm sure Rick will get into some of the specifics, but there are certain plans that we looked at where instead of necessarily you having to go to an emergency room, you might be what we refer to as assess and refer. So, I fell down, hurt my ankle, whatever, I call 911. They increased the level of triage. So I don't know if anybody here had to call 911 over the last few months for whatever reason, but they increased the level of triage that they were doing. So the 911 operators would ask a lot more questions of you. And if you fell into a certain category or you answered certain questions in a positive way, they would tag you as an emerging infectious disease potential, EID potential. And so they would then advise the responding crews that you were EID positive. And so that made them aware, so they would take a little bit different approach too. But with the assess and refer, what it looked at is, well, sir, you hurt your ankle, you don't necessarily need to go to the emergency room, urgent care might be a better choice, you might want to just call your primary care physician, something like that. Because the other thing that we had to look at was, how is this going to impact the hospitals? And, Mike again would have a different, very interesting perspective on that, but surge capacity. Right now, if you look, I believe it's Riverside County is pretty much at their max. They can't take any more patients right now. So that whole surge capacity piece, very important stuff. The interesting thing is that we saw a decrease in the number of calls, interestingly enough. If we look between March and April and May of 2019, those 2 months, we had 1,865 calls. If we look, in April of 2019, we had 1,865 calls. In April of 20, we had 1,595 calls. So, Mike, to your point, people were not calling 911 when they needed to. And the impact of that is now the call volume is starting to increase back up, but they're also seeing now that some people that had, I'll say, deferred their calling are now facing more significant medical needs because of that. And certain types of calls that we deferred or that were deferred so we had a significant reduction in the number of people that called for chest pain. Well, we had an increase in the number of calls for CPR or cardiac arrest. So it's a little bit difficult. I don't know, again, from Rick's perspective, can they make a strong correlation to something, but if you are having chest pain and you choose not to call, and then a few hours later, you go into cardiac arrest, what is that? Could you have been better served if you would have called early on? So the other, I just mentioned this to Rick earlier, the other significant decrease in incidents that we responded to were traffic crashes. Between April and May of 2019 and April and May of 2020, there was about a third reduction in the number of traffic crashes. And I'm thinking there was probably fewer people on the road. The interesting thing is that the number of those, yeah, it was reduced, the number of those traffic crashes, but the severity of those crashes increased. So yeah, they were, you know, there's fewer people on the road, so let's go faster. And then when they did crash, you know, they were more severe. Kind of interesting. The number of fires increased dramatically in April and May of 2020. Almost again by 40%. So is that a reflection of because people are just, they're frustrated, they're bored, or whatever?
Let's set the house on fire.
I don't know. You know, let's take care of this COVID thing. We got our insurance premium paid up, right? Let's set the house on fire. The level of emergency service resources in the high desert is very strained almost on a daily basis, much less when you throw in COVID-19 and some of the things that we ended up having to face. Because you'll end up tying up, you know, we'll have one of these traffic crashes and we'll end up having, you know, several of our units respond, an ambulance respond, sheriff has to respond, you know, so maybe 3, 4, 5 sheriffs responding depending on what the incident is, specifics. So, you know, we can easily impact a lot of our resources. So there was a lot of times where our resources were very strained as far as that goes. A lot of the more specific stories, I don't know, did anybody see pictures of some of the responders wearing like hazmat suits? You know, that was a little bit, I mean, we don't know all the facts, so, you know, let's go full out hazmat suit and everything. Not really necessary. Really, the biggest thing is put a mask on and wear your goggles and wear gloves and just follow what we consider universal precautions, which is, you know, you want to wash your hands after every incident and so on and so forth. So those are the things that will minimize the risk to responders in that. Crews had a lot of interesting stories. Probably shouldn't share most of them, I'll say. But they had a lot of interesting stories, things that, you know, they saw in homes, and some of the injuries they did go to were likely from people being cooped up in the house together and a little bit bored. So, but from the fire and EMS world, you know, this is not the first time this has happened. It's not the last time it's going to continue. In fact, if you read, there's actually they've identified a potential initiating point for something new, even now. So we'll wait and see on that one.
Is that the swine flu you're talking about?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Possible new strain of that. So let's add on to that. But and from the fire and EMS world, that's all I have. So I'll turn it over to my counterpart here, Captain Bessinger.
Okay, thanks for coming today, guys. I think it's important for we all know what's going on in our community. So let me touch up when this first began. Just from the Sheriff's Department side, obviously my main responsibility is the City of Victorville, being assigned as the commander there. But as a Sheriff Department as a whole, when this first kicked off, we started our Department Operations Center. And that's similar to the Emergency Operations Center with the county, except our Department Operations Center is just at our department on a department level. So we got together as the executive team to look at what are our concerns going to be. Number one, because as Chief Benson said, we're usually prepared for things that may come up like this. So we do have emergency supplies. So we had PPE for our employees. We had the initial response things we needed as soon as it kicked off. Some of the concern became, how do we keep getting those supplies as the demand for them skyrocketed? An example of the PPE supplies that we have, other than we normally wear gloves on a daily basis at work, things like that, we had plenty of those. We also have our PPE that is, they can don a gown, a mask, goggles, boot coverings, so if they go into a situation they can fully deploy all of that stuff. So we had that, we just need to set into motion being able to acquire some of that stuff as this went along, because we didn't know how long it was going to go, of course. Then we had to set up some processes. How do we still serve the community and keep them safe and keep our employees safe. So one of the things you may have saw in the news is some departments actually cut their services and said, we're not coming unless it's an emergency. Like someone's dying, someone's getting robbed, life emergency, not property. Our executive team, the sheriff, was very adamant that we were not going to do that. We're still going to service the community. So how do we do that in this situation? So administratively, our stations are mostly protected. We already have glass coverings at the front counters, things like that. So I know a lot of governmental offices were closed. We did not close our front counters because there was protection there in place already. We did alter some of our services. We do fingerprint services for pre-employment purposes for many companies and things like that. So because that created contact, we went ahead and postponed those and basically put a pause on doing things like that. And we still have not started that again. So while we still maintain the services, we looked at what can we do to mitigate some of the risk factors that aren't really technically an emergency that we have to do. So once we established our level of service, then we had to look at how do we protect the community, how do we protect our deputies when they're going to calls. So what we initiated was basically kind of a form of triage. When someone calls 911 to the Sheriff's Dispatch Center, they will be asked minimal health questions as not to be too much into privacy, but enough to let us know, is there anybody at the location that has tested positive for COVID? Is there anyone at the location that has experienced the signs and symptoms that we're all now familiar with? So that dispatcher can then put that in a call and notify deputies going to a location their risk factor to help them determine how they need to go into this. And what a lot of folks don't realize or forget, because generally on television and stuff we go into shootings and things like that. Well, the police department on a lot of medical calls are actually the first people to arrive, just because we're out driving around the community. So when you get someone not breathing call, especially baby not breathing, but anybody suffering an immediate medical emergency, we get notified as well as the fire department, and we will actually oftentimes beat them there, just depending on where a unit is. So we did have a lot of folks calling in saying, yes, I have symptoms, or yes, I tested positive. So that puts a whole new spin on what do our deputies do at this point. That's when they would don the full PPE, if need be, and go in if they needed to do CPR or some kind of life-saving measures until EMS could get there. The other balance was if the person was stable, you don't necessarily have to make contact, maintain airway, things like that, and let EMS get there. So those are some of the things we had to deal with besides our enforcement side of our job, which we're most known for going out, obviously. And that was one of the challenges from a department standpoint and from an industry standpoint. Social distancing isn't really a choice for us because our job requires us to contact folks. Now, when you're talking to them and things like that, that's fine. But once it goes beyond that and you have to effect an arrest or break up fights between people, you're coming in contact with folks. So that's where we initiated the mask, of course. I always feel like I'm going to rob a bank when I put this thing on, but it's important. So those are some of the measures we took at the onset. What we've been doing from a statistical standpoint is monitoring it weekly, the various things that we're experiencing, because as the chief said, there's no like beginning and end to this. It's kind of this flow. So kind of a little bit contrary as far as calls for service, he was saying his went down. Ours during that month in 19, we had 11,727 calls. In 20, we had 13,040 calls. So our calls actually went up. Now, can we directly say this because of COVID? No, it's just monitoring our normal status of calls. And they fluctuate, they ebb and flow with what's going on in people's lives. There's a lot of things you can't control. But one of the interesting things is at the beginning of this are talking about domestic violence. So we can track it a couple ways. And, you know, anyone familiar with statistics, you can track that very many ways. Calls we get that are considered domestic violence, you get there's actually no domestic violence crime. You keep the peace, parties, you know, okay, calm down, somebody leaves, whatever the case may be. Or ones that there's actual domestic violence crime where you have to take a report number, and then there's the courts that come into play. So yes, calls did go up on domestic violence. Ultimately, but at first they came down about 8%. So we were thinking, oh, that's interesting. Then they shot up 17%. which was just from the actual reports. So of course everybody has their ideas that everybody was happy to be together, maybe being home for a while, and after everybody started driving everybody crazy, maybe then calls went up. Who knows? I mean, honestly, who knows? But I can understand people get cabin fever and you get frustrated. I think maybe some folks that usually don't have arguments maybe start having some arguments, and we were called. Quite a lot of them didn't require a report number, but it's one of the trends we saw. One of the kind of troubling trends that I saw is child abuse. So child abuse went down 70%. Sounds good, right? But then as we tracked it further, and we're seeing as things are starting to quasi-normalize now they're up 130%. So some of the idea behind it is that these children are at home. They're not going to school to tell a teacher that something occurred to them. They're not going to baseball, soccer. There's no outlet for them to express maybe what happened. So that's troubling, obviously. Was one of those things that I didn't expect when we were looking at the statistics. And then of course traffic collisions did come down quite a bit. One of the challenges, which you guys already touched on, was actually traffic came down, and I, being one of the people that still have to come to work every day, my drive to work every day, great. I kind of love it. But you'd also see the guy go by you at 100 miles an hour because there was nobody on the road. And so Greg's right, when we did have the traffic collisions, they tended to be more serious. And we also experienced a lot more traffic collisions that were single vehicle traffic collisions. Folks losing control because probably driving a little bit too fast. So those were some of the statistical things that we saw that came up that kind of raised your eyebrows a little bit, but we're going to keep tracking it as it goes, because like we said, there's not really an end point where you can say from here to there. We're still experiencing this with all the other things that are going on. I will say that it's the PPE has been easier to get now after the spike. I think a lot of folks have gotten that stuff. We're able to get that. We're still maintaining the triage. When you call 911, they'll ask those questions to try to keep everybody safe. Interestingly enough, we were concerned when we established protocols, well, what happens if we have a deputy exposed? What do? Because now do you take the entire shift that's working and they all go in quarantine for 14 days? How do you manage that and still serve the community? You can't just put a close sign out of the police department and say, well, 14, 30 days, we'll see you, and hopefully everything goes fine, right? So we set up some protocols for that, but interestingly, we didn't really have to implement them. The ones that we experienced, and we have not had anyone at our station test positive for COVID. We have had relatives of people at our station test positive for it. So what we end up doing is we have that employee, if it's a relative they live with and have had contact with, that one employee will end up self-quarantining for 14 days before coming back to work, so we don't risk exposure to the entire station. And that's really what we've only had to deal with at this point, which has been beneficial. Some of the changes, I think you all know about the zero bail that happened because of COVID, where we weren't keeping people in custody as long. What our jails also initiated was if someone does have to be booked into the jail, before you would go out, walk into what they call the intake area to process the paperwork and all that. You cannot walk into the facility until nurses physically come outside, asked you all the questions, tested both the deputy and the arrestee, their temperature, all of that. Trying to minimize any exposure to the rest of the facility, because once a facility is exposed, obviously you risk everybody in it. So there's a lot of protocols we put in place for that, which helped. I think are still helping. It's still going to be a challenge moving forward, just because it's not over. But I think from the big scheme of things, I think California's done a really decent job at it in comparison to some of the other things we've learned, talking throughout the public safety community and exchanging information on, hey, is this a good idea, or maybe not such a good idea, trying to learn from one another. So I think we're doing pretty good, and we'll keep tracking forward and see where we go from here. But with that, do you have any questions on anything? Yes, sir.
A couple of them. Am I making the right assumption that theft and burglary were probably down since people were home?
Matter of fact, they were. Burglary went down, not too much. It went down almost 8% initially. And then now we're Now we're back up 3.7%.
I always
So
thought it would gone down almost nothing because everyone was home.
not everyone was home.
Well,
That actually was the problem because in a lot of communities,
they had left.
yeah.
So the other question, it's a silly one, but did you get any of the silly calls where someone called because their son-in-law wouldn't wear a mask, or I can see grandma calling up and getting mad and
Yes,
trying to get you guys to come and make them wear a mask?
yes, and yes, and yes. Did I mention yes? We would literally get calls of there's a guy walking down the street not wearing a mask.
But he's
Anybody?
outside.
Yeah, is anybody around him? Okay. You know, and I get people, you know, you want people concerned, but we would get some calls that really,
We're ridiculous.
okay, we appreciate it, thank you very much, but we're not putting people in jail for not wearing a mask. It's just not gonna happen. Yes, ma'am.
Are notaries allowed back into the jails?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would be willing to say no right now because there's a lot of things that we suspended when this first started, like our ride-along program, our explorers at the station, the kids, you know, no, stay home, our PFAL program, things like that. So our volunteers, we really limited and stopped everyone coming in to try to prevent it. So as of right now, I'm gonna guess I'm probably like 99% sure it's a no.
The question was, are notaries allowed back in the jails? Because I got an ever-growing list of power of attorneys and paperwork.
I'm sure.
So I can't
I'm sure.
The serving, I can go take it to the front desk. Now, that's not understood. But it's the part of them physically signing the power of attorneys and stuff.
I will, if you're gonna be here next week or it's a holiday or whatever, but I'll find out, I'll ask and I'll let you know.
This second question has nothing to do with COVID. Fireworks.
Fireworks, what do you mean?
What are we gonna do?
What fireworks?
What are we doing?
Are you hearing fireworks?
No, I wanna know who I call and what do I
Okay.
do?
So, the city, so fireworks, the city of Victorville specifically has a task force where the fire department, code enforcement, sheriff's department all work together. We even do some little covert stuff where I have undercover guys driving around because one of the hardest things to do is identify who is doing it, right? They see a police car, a fire truck drive down the road, well, they're not gonna light off a firework. So I've got some secret squirrel guys driving around identifying, and then what happens is we come in with code enforcement and they get an administrative citation. Primarily, we dealt with it that way because the criminal justice system from a criminal side is so backed up and it's not a high priority, nothing really happens. So from an administrative standpoint, when they're being fined by code enforcement, we all know, unfortunately, if you get hit in the pocketbook, that hurts the worst. So that was the avenue taken. We have been very successful this year in recovering a lot of fireworks. With that being said, by no means do I think we're, you know, okay, the problem's done and that kind of thing, because even sitting at my home, which actually we live kind of close together, and I look to the right, I'm in my backyard, and I look to the right and I see like an entire fireworks show in the air, like I'm at the Orange Show or up here, the fairgrounds. But he lives that way, so I was asking, what are those fireworks confiscated?
You got to do something with those confiscated fireworks.
But we are working on it. I know it's troublesome, so we have on the city website, we have where you can go on the website and put in a complaint. What we're asking is, we do allow people to do it anonymously, of course, but as much detail as possible, like even a potential, I think it's this address helps us, because I can have my secret squirrel guys go out there and set up and look at the address and watch it, because some of the problems we get is, yes, there's obviously fireworks being shot up, but it's in Victorville, okay, we get that, but any detailed information helps us to be more proactive on the enforcement at that particular location, and the more sites we can issue. So the more help we can get, absolutely.
Well, I mean, this is an official thing, but I threatened to throw balloons and eggs on somebody's car because it wouldn't stop when my dog was going insane. So, it's just an idea.
It's creative.
Yeah.
Our dog is coming out. He's very, very anxious. He's
Gotcha.
busted through our windows, our home windows. He just
Yeah.
Yeah,
gets.
absolutely, that's one of the problems.
So I really got angry at the neighbor. Of course, it's not us. It's what it is I live right down the street and we flash field ones.
Gotcha.
So what do? If they're in the field? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's part of the, and we'll go watch the area, but any detailed information is always helpful to us. And like I said, that's what we're trying to identify those folks. And then the fines incrementally go up too. So if we get you more than once, it's going to start getting expensive. So hopefully that'll be, you know, motivation for them to stop. And I'm with you, I'll be sitting in my yard and I can hear, you know, they're mortars. They're not like the little safe and sane or even just a firecracker. I mean, they shake your windows. And I'm like, seriously? You know, and part of the challenge with that is in the past, as a state, we used to do interdiction. Like at some of the, how you have the agricultural points and stuff like that coming in, we used to randomly do interdiction for fireworks. All that's gone now. So it's basically kind of a free flow of bringing fireworks into, you know, areas that we're not supposed to have them. Not to mention they're just basically, you know, bombs essentially. So we're working on it. We are there. Yeah, any information. And then if it's really something bad, rather than going to the website, I know it's all bad, but if it's like an emergency, obviously call dispatch and we'll get out there and do what we have to do.
Yeah, any problems with Black Lives Matters? You know, we see some of the area, the stores boarded up, you know, Orange and Apple Valley. I just wondered, the desert if we had a lot of problems with it.
Okay, so the protest that we've had up here when all that first kicked off, we only had one night where I would consider it a bad night. All the protests have been peaceful. So we had a protest that was on Bear Valley and Armagosa during the day on a Saturday that was very peaceful. Those folks were, as a matter of fact, they were great. They even had safety officers and vests keeping people on the sidewalk and not getting in the Bear Valley Road to get run over. And that's what I was worried about. So that was great. I was out there watching that. What happened is when the sun goes down for some reason, the folks that want to go out and wreak havoc now decide to show up. So they showed up and kind of took over the protest, if you will. So the folks that were there protesting initially didn't obviously want to be around them and left. So immediately what happened is the folks that came at night wanted to start some problems. They went over to Walmart and they went over to Staples and they started trying to break the windows and so on and so forth. We had units respond. The first units that pulled up, I had a female deputy take a rock in the arm and busted her side window and hit her on the arm, on the forearm. As she went on scene, they immediately started throwing rocks at the units. So what we did from a standpoint of our station, our analysis was, if people were going to have protests and be peaceful about it and all that, that's what our country's built off of. Great. We'll provide for safety, protest. That's absolutely great. But when you start doing things like they were doing, that's not a protest, that's criminal. So we deployed our teams that we had prepared in case something happened. We did initiate using pepper ball guns, which pepper ball guns, I don't know if anybody's seen like paintball guns. It's basically the same thing, it's just a round like paintball, except what's in it instead of paint is pepper spray. So you can actually shoot it above people against the building and it can rain, the pepper spray can rain down on top of them. Or you can shoot them with them and it doesn't feel good, it feels like a paintball. But the pepper spray comes out so it has that pepper spray effect. Those were very effective in getting them away from the businesses right away, using a less lethal kind of option. And then we were able to actually start, our approach was dispersing them. So as that crowd dispersed into smaller groups, it was easier now to arrest them because now you're not dealing with a big group. And as the crowd keeps dispersing, what ends up happening is you can identify, usually there's one or two in there that I call the troublemakers. They're the ones that are bringing everybody else along doing things they probably wouldn't do by themselves. So as you can watch and identify them, if you go in tactically when they get kind of on the edge of where everything's going and arrest them, everything else seems to de-escalate. And that's what we did, and it worked. That was the only night we had problems. We did have 20 businesses experience damage, most of them broken windows. We didn't have anyone get into a business successfully and burglarize it like was happening down the hill. And that was the only night we had any kind of thing like that. We did have protests after that. Thankfully, they were all peaceful. You know, some folks were yelling and calling us names and things like that, but that's still peaceful. At least they're not doing any actions that's bad. So we've been very lucky up here when it comes to that. I think part of that is because of how we approached it. If you're being peaceful, great. If you're going to go do some criminal activity, we're not going to put up with that. We're going to have to stop it. Because unfortunately, if that keeps rolling forward, and it just basically kind of empowers them to keep, you know, breaking into businesses and things. I think we can all agree that's just not good for the community. So that was kind of the approach we took. Seemed to work, like I say. We've had protests since where they've cooperated and stayed on the sidewalk and held signs, and that's great. That's the way it should be. So thus far, we're okay. We did have some folks have to deploy down to San Bernardino when stuff was going on down there because there was all kinds of burglaries and things like that. But
If I could, I'd like to just mention something about the fireworks. So if you guys are all, you're all familiar, has anybody got an extra $1,000? Because that's the fine now this year. It went from $100 last year up to $1,000. And with that, we've also, Victorville Fire has also responded to, as of last night, 16 different fires that are related to fireworks. So that, and I want to say that total maybe off just a little bit, but there's been, I want to say, at least 40 citations that have been given. And I think we've confiscated in excess of 350 pounds of fireworks, somewhere in there.
Are you splitting that with Rotary?
Yeah, we could work something out if you want. I'd also, I know Steve is telling us here to move on, but I'd also like to recognize one of the things that's been, from the COVID-19, it was very helpful, was antigen testing. And Dr. Sean Smith and Dr. Brian Bowtie, or Bowtie Brian, I'm sorry, they were able to get the fire department these antigen tests, which has proven to be very helpful. It literally, it's a test that takes about 10 minutes to do, so, and it tells whether you've been exposed to it or had it in the past. And we've used it on a number of employees to help to screen them. So, you know, Bowtie Brian's assistance has been great. For not only the fire department, but for the city and his involvement and their involvement in some of the other issues out there. So I wanted to call them out specifically for that. So, sorry. Question, ma'am?
We were talking earlier about child abuse. My concern is if children are inside the home and they have nowhere to go, like the school, the park, the coaches, church, do we have a plan for these kids to be what they can do?
what they can do as far as what do you mean if?
As to reporting what's happening to them, whether it's molestation, being beat up, being starved to death, whatever the reason may be.
Gotcha.
How do they communicate with someone else that can help them get them out of that home?
We've actually seen the trend going back up as far as the reporting of them. Primarily, I think, because some of the restrictions were being loosened a little bit. It often depends on the age of the child, of course. Some will pick up the phone and call us. Some will go to a friend's house if they're a little bit older, depending. The younger kids, of course, generally don't. So we have seen it going up or being notified now that some restrictions are loosening. It's kind of hard to say when you have the family structure and environment where kids aren't leaving, parents aren't leaving, everyone's in a house. How does something get exposed that suspect is trying to hide? You know what I mean? So a lot of it comes back to education for the kids, which a lot of the schools and everyone is trying to push forward. You know, hey, if someone's doing something to you, tell us. So it's starting to come. They're getting reported now that things are getting loosened up, but that's all we can really do is reinforce that to the children and hope that they do say something. Because quite often, I think one of the major problems with some of, not getting too much into that subject matter, but quite often one of the problems is the non-reporting of it.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.